Australia is slowly returning to a pre-pandemic way of life. The nation's swift actions when COVID first appeared seem to be paying off. The country is reporting just over 29,000 cases and 909 reported deaths, a stark contrast to places like the U.S., Brazil, and the U.K. Over the past few weeks, we have seen businesses reopen, people eating indoors, large events going on, and fans sitting in the stands of the Australian Open. Joining us now to talk more about this is Ursula Heger. She is the senior reporter with our partners at 10 News. Ursula, welcome. Great to have you with us. Can you break down exactly what is behind Australia's success? What's been done differently from other countries who are still struggling with the pandemic like ours here? What can we take away from Australia's success?
Well, Tanya, I think Australia's success can really be defined by a bit of good luck, but also a bit of good management. Australia's policymakers essentially went very hard, very fast, very early on in this pandemic. That in part was due to the fact that at the time this hit, Australia was coming out of an unprecedented natural disaster. We had very devastating wildfires across this country at the time. We saw thousands of homes lost and dozens of lives lost as well. And that really instilled in the minds of Australian politicians that they needed to throw all of the resources they could at this and certainly not let it get to a state where it got out of control. As a result, Australia closed its borders very early on. We closed in March of last year. They remain closed 12 months later to everybody except for Australian citizens. We have seen some exemptions to that. Obviously, the Australian Open saw tennis players flying in, and now New Zealand citizens can also fly into the country. But essentially, what those tennis players discovered was the other element to Australia's success, when that is our hotel quarantine program. This basically uses all of those city hotels that tourists would ordinarily use and requires anybody who has come to the country, any of those Australian citizens, to quarantine for 2 weeks inside a hotel room. Essentially, these are quite harsh conditions. They're not allowed outside for exercise. They're certainly not allowed outside for any kind of a break. A lot of the times, their windows don't even open, and they are required to stay in there. They can't have any visitors and undergo a series of coronavirus tests. If indeed they do test positive, they then have to stay in there for longer. And that essentially stops this problem of the virus moving in from other countries and really controls that issue. On the ground here, we also have something very basic called contact tracing. This is a very low-tech exercise where essentially anybody who tests positive to the virus is called by health officials on the basis of anonymity, and they're required to give those health officials precise details about exactly who they might have come into contact with, as well as any public places like restaurants or cafes that they have visited. That information is then collated throughout their entire infectious period. Any of those public places that are noted, those are released to the public, and anybody else who might have been there during that time are also required to go into 2 weeks of isolation, as well as that person's family and friends.
And what has the public's response been to all of these rules and regulations? Have they been fairly cooperative? Did they understand from the beginning that this was going to be so successful? And at the same time, is there anything the public feels officials can improve upon?
Well, yes, I think the Australian public have responded very well to this. Again, we were coming out of that natural disaster. So I think Australians were really ready to be a part of the effort here, and that has certainly helped public officials. I've spoken to a number of them ahead of this interview, and they certainly said that the Australian response to this from members of the public has been crucial, in part because that contact tracing relies on people to tell the truth. If they're not going to admit that they might have been seeing somebody that their wife wouldn't want them to know about, if they're not willing to admit that to officials on the basis of anonymity, then that person is, of course, a threat to the wider public. So this has essentially been very well received in Australia, and I think As Australia moved forward with this, we've seen huge periods of time where there are simply no cases in this country. And as a result, a lot of the restrictions that you see in the rest of the world, and of course, the devastating death toll that we're seeing in the rest of the world has become very stark and very obvious to Australians how lucky we have it in some respects in this country. In relation to what could be done better, Australia has been in relation to rollout. This is in some ways because we don't need to have this urgency. They didn't actually have emergency approval for the two vaccines that have been approved here, the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer jab. Both of them went through the full regulatory process before they were allowed to be injected in people's arms. That was in some allowing more confidence with the Australian community that they had been properly vetted before being rolled out. But as a result, Australia is a lot slower on this issue than other countries, in particular. Israel is a lot further ahead. At the moment, Australia has had 100,000 people given their first dose, but it's like at this stage that Australia is not going to meet its early vaccination schedule that we were hoping to see around 4 million people vaccinated by the end of April. It doesn't look at this stage like we will make that target. And the problem with that is that, unfortunately, while we're all very free to move around within Australia, that means we certainly can't go overseas until we've had both of those shots.
Right. Well, at least the vaccine effort is making progress. Ursula Heger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.